lot of good information also that Ramona shared, and I just want to sort of echo some of this, particularly about WLRC, being a very, very inclusive space, a very safe space, a very welcoming space to be in and with its resources. So if you're here at UIC on campus, definitely, come over and see and engage with some of the work that they are doing. So anyway, hello and good afternoon, everyone. As Ramona said, I'm Ishani. I'm from the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm faculty in the Department of Communication. So I'm really delighted to be here. And of course, I want to thank the Women's Leadership and Resource Center for providing this opportunity, for giving me this inclusive space to share my research with all of you. So thank you for all of you who took the time to be here today in person and on Zoom. And a special shout out to Ramona Gupta for working with me to organize this. Thanks so much, Ramona. So again, in the interest of time, I will try to kind of just touch on some aspects of this research that I was recently involved in. But before I do that, I would sort of like to start by reflecting on how, we are living in a very interesting, complex, a very challenging and maybe, even a surreally numbing time, to say the least, right? Some folks say that we are in a post-COVID world now. Some say we are in a new or an evolving COVID world now. Whatever the case that, might be. And I think there is truth to both these perspectives. And to say the least, probably we're definitely in the midst of something where, something else is about to kind of, permeate there. What also happens is, these cycles will come and go. But what will remain and what remains, very unfortunately, are those locally situated crises and normalized oppressions that not only bubble up to the surface, much more and more than before, for sure, during times like this, but somehow they become bigger, they become more widespread because of these other crises which become the context for it. And this is also what happened in many parts of the world during the height of the pandemic. India was no exception, which is where my case study is kind of drawn from. So in this presentation, as I said, I would like to focus and discuss certain aspects of my engagement and exploration of the Lockdown May Lock Up campaign, digital campaign. Essentially, the term Lockdown May Lock Up means locked up in the lockdown. The word may here is a Hindi word, which can be thought of as in or within or inside. And so what this was an anti-domestic violence digital campaign, which was floated and mobilized during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in India, during the country's lockdown period of 2020, mainly, but sort of even going into 2021. And this is an area, particularly looking at domestic violence, looking at the digital tools of advocacy, how there are limitations and possibilities for creating mobilization around such issues. And this is something that I have been looking at for over a decade now. But this time around, what really interested me, or what I was very engaged in, is understanding the visual and symbolic power, or limitations even, of using digital tools for feminist advocacy. So I turned to certain knowledge frames that I felt would help me in exploring this. So I looked at the frames of embodied resistance. I looked at performed connectivity, invisibility politics. And again, I'll get a little bit more into this in a bit. So I drew on the work of digital feminist and visual communication scholars, gender studies scholars, particularly the works of Fatima Aziz, Deborah Faraday, Matthias Ekman, Andreas Woodholm, Sanaz Raji, who've taken a lot of this work in different sort of areas, but also very interconnected areas, and combined them. So that helped me to kind of get clarity on a lot of these dynamics. Secondly, I was very keen to dissect how some of the tropes, even standalone, like gender, body, power, affect, celebrity, performance, injustice, all of this are being visually framed. How are they being disturbed? How are they being problematized? Even intervened by such digitally mediated advocacies like the Lockdown and Lockup campaign in the context of an unthinkable and unrelenting global health crisis. And of course, to top it all, India's gender violence endemic, which is always present. And at times like this, even more so. And before I go ahead, I do want to just give a little bit of a trigger warning here, a disclaimer that some of the textual data, visual examples, images that I've used in the presentation may contain symbolic depictions or graphic depictions of domestic violence or its connected stories that some of you may find disturbing or traumatic. I do apologize for that in advance. However, I have included them to support my research findings and also for us to make sort of more sense of this case study that I will be talking about today. Also to get a deeper understanding of some one particular key social injustice that needs our attention. And so, given all of that, I still do recommend viewer discretion and care in case you need to do it. So please feel free to do what you need to do for self-care. So the lockdown in India, as I just sort of mentioned, has had a tremendous impact on a large section of its women, socially, economically, in terms of public and professional mobilities. It has upended, their personal lives, their emotional, mental health, the physical, reproductive, and sexual well-being of so many people, and in such oppressive ways, particularly for at-risk and marginalized women and female population in India. So what we saw happening in that time was their bodies, their minds, their labor, their domiciles becoming the sites of patriarchal as well as capitalist exploitation. So India's stay-at-home order, which followed the start and sort of the spread of the COVID-19 or coronavirus, began in March of 2020. And of course, it was a very needed step, right? Not just in India, all over the world, when countries started going into lockdown, because that was, at that time, the only way to contain the spread of the virus. However, what also happened is other crises, other social ills, be they public ills or private ills, gender-based or other social class, identity, caste-based, injustices. Not only did they find leverage in that context of immobility, but they were also slipping further through the cracks of official systems and injustices, as well as institutions that already failed to acknowledge the seriousness of these other social ills, or to provide some sort of help, or to kind of give them the resources that they needed to address or alleviate them. And one such oppression, one such social ill, is domestic violence against Indian women, and in this case, Indian women. And according to Ravindran Shah, there was this increase in cases and reporting by 131% by May of 2020. So in 2 months, from March to May, that is how much domestic violence against women were trapped in their houses, in their homes, in their domiciles, with their partners and marital families, and in many cases also with their biological families, saw that increase. And particularly, as Ravindran Shah say, that these were more severe in areas where the COVID-19 lockdown rules were more strictly enforced. So I do have a short video that explains some of the fallouts of the pandemic on women, particularly at-risk abuse of women. This is from social workers, lawyers, and other advocates. However, I will leave this till the end, or if we're not able to show it today, whether in the interest of time or if technology doesn't sort of support us, I'm happy to share links of one or two of the videos I have, which can you all please feel free to go and take a look at it. But I would recommend this. Now I do have let me kind of get back to this. I had to naturally also look at what some policymakers, some politicians, particularly coming from a more feminist perspective, were thinking about this, were thinking about the state of women, were thinking about what could be done for at-risk and marginalized women during the lockdown period. And so I turned to sort of what Shushmita Dev, who's an Indian politician, she's a member of parliament from the eastern Indian state of West Bengal, said. And they was worried about the impact that the lockdown would have on India's marginalized female population, because she strongly believed that there is what she calls a lack of a gender-specific approach in the ways policies are, particularly crisis handling policies. No women's voices, women were not a part of that framework to consider. And that is why she said that women were not, the needs of women were not being considered either, especially thinking about the fact that up to 65% of or more of the unorganized economic sector is made up of women in their labor. And so many of these women were likely to lose their jobs. They were likely to lose access to public and social mobility, which in and of itself is a dire consequence, because a lot of these women live in poverty. So being in this situation could then lead to even more dire consequences. She also talked about the issue that we all sort of know of in generally as well, of unpaid care work, right? Which is, again, as I said, no surprise, because it is typically and largely borne by women in their homes, many of whom must also work outside. Perhaps they have multiple jobs, in addition to second shift duties like childcare, elderly care, cooking, cleaning, caring, for the family, and everything else that goes with it. And so while this was predicted, and a lot of this did happen, we also saw other feminist voices. For example, there is a lawyer and feminist researcher by the name of Kirti Jayakumar, and she noted that many senior Indian women, elderly Indian women, were also kind of already battling severe health issues, were immunocompromised during this time. And many of them were also being physically, mentally, and in other forms abused within their spaces, within their domiciles. And this compounded the disenfranchisement that they already faced because of their health and being immunocompromised. And so at that time, there was little recourse but for community-based organizations, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, people working individually, advocating individually on the ground, on digital platforms, more so on digital platforms, because guess what? The whole nation was immobile. Something had to be done. And so one such nonprofit by the name of Sneha, a gender and youth-focused social work nonprofit, based in Mumbai, which is an eastern urban city in India. Western city in India, created and started the Lockdown May Lock Up campaign. I'll refer to it as LDMNU as well, in May 2020, with the help of a digital media agency called Surity. And their main intent was to raise funds so that they could get more financial resources, they could get more legal resources to address the 100% increase in helpline calls that they were getting during the lockdown in those 2 months from victims and survivors of domestic violence, from stakeholders, some of whom were already their clients. And so they needed to find a way to continue providing the support and intervention, probably knowing that now more than ever, they need to do more. And so their campaign message was quite clear. They wanted to give a name and a face and a voice, as they, to quote them, to Sneha's victims, their clients and survivors, by letting users on social media adopt a name from a list of names that they came up with as part of the campaign and floated on their Instagram page. They also asked other social media users and Instagrammers to post their own images or selfies using the words "I am," followed by the name of a domestic violence survivor or victim from Sneha's campaign page. And their campaign to call out domestic violence, amplification, exacerbation during the lockdown also kind of initially started on a smaller scale, with around 10 social influencers or celebrities who Sneha reached out to themselves, but who also offered to help pro bono. They offered to spread Sneha's appeal among their followers using Instagram. So Instagram was sort of the common platform for all of this, because the campaign was visually curated and powerful. And Instagram's affordances lent itself to, helping mobilize this. And also as part of the campaign, they shared, as I said, these visuals, which were, in a sense, almost performing the experiences of violence that Indian women were battling during the lockdown. And along with that, there was information, there were resources related to domestic violence helplines, safe spaces, donation links, COVID-19 resources, other health, mental health, physical health, reproductive health resources, pro bono legal health resources that were also being shared. So moving on, I now needed to turn my attention to the visual urgency and some of the visual affordances of social platforms like Instagram. Why Instagram? Why selfies in particular? Why visual artifacts to push this particular movement forward? And in this case, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was drawn to the work of Matthias Eckermann and Andreas Wilhelm, who talk about digitally mediated visuals and selfies in particular as artifacts that perform connectivity and stand as symbols of contemporary communication. And it's interesting because I think to a certain extent we understand it. They talk of platforms like Instagram as a significant resource for the production and cultivation of identity and fandom in the digital era. Again, something that we probably see a lot of happening and have some sort of identification with to a certain extent. And so I wanted to take this idea forward and further when looking for more research of this idea of performed connectivity and digital activism in the global south. And so I turned to Fatima Aziz's work on visual activism and feminist agency and visibility politics. She looks at work around feminist agency and suppression of civic engagement and speech among women, particularly in Pakistan. And here she also talks about using selfies that have often been done for advocacy reasons. So the selfie as a photographic practice also gives visibility to previously invisible female citizens and reifies their claims to civic identity. And this is to quote from Aziz's work. Similarly, the stories of domestic violence and sexual trauma survivors has also been historically the subject of censure in many public places, not just in India, globally. There's, again, no surprise there. And one way to challenge this repeated and even oppressive censoring and silencing that we see has been for invested people, invested selves, we ourselves, others, stakeholders, to, visually embody. And that's one way, what Deborah Faraday calls breaking the silence in both public contexts and in private contexts. And to further quote from Faraday, in varied forms and spaces of resistance. And this becomes just one of many spaces of resistance that was available and that was viable at an otherwise very immobile time in our recent history. So a little bit about the methodology, and then I would like to focus more on some of the themes that I categorize my observations, findings, and the visuals sort of under. I did intend to show you all a short video, which was actually a part of the campaign officially created by the digital media agency Siriti for Sneha's Lockdown We Lock Up campaign. But again, I will happily share the link later, so please feel free. We may be having a little bit of a technical issue at this point. We all live in a Zoom world, we understand this. So I'll leave it at that. But anyway, to kind of come back to sort of understanding the reach and the implications and the limitations of this digital anti-domestic violence campaign and its sort of possible future directions, some of its deviations as well, I wanted to frame my work in particular around a larger query, so to speak, a guiding question. And I wanted to ask, how has the pandemic's impact on domestic violence against Indian women been visually represented by the Lockdown We Lock Up hashtivism? And in terms of representation, I mean, how is how has it been thematized? How has it been interrupted and problematized as well? And intervened, because that was also happening. So the data that I used for this inductive thematic analysis, which is the method I follow, comprises close to 1,700 images, which is made up of selfies, digital graphics, videos, Insta stories, reels, even visuals created outside of the campaign and outside of Sneha, but where the particular campaign and Sneha were also tagged. And that is sort of speaks to the short-term success of the campaign, which I'll touch on later in the presentation as well. So basically, what was common to this entire sample of graphics and Instagram visuals was that they all contained the hashtag lockdown lockup and were posted on Instagram between May 11th, 2020 to December 16th, 2020. Basically coinciding with the day this digital campaign was officially launched on Instagram by Sneha and Siriti to the day the last post of 2020 was floated. It was kind of interesting too, because it also kind of coincided by the main extent of the lockdown happening at the time. And the reason I wanted to sort of go with an inductive thematic analysis is because I felt it suited the scope of my work. Thematic analysis essentially is a qualitative method, critical method of curating and coding social and cultural data. It was actually used a lot in nursing sciences, health sciences, and psychology, but we see a lot of its use now in social sciences and in humanities as well. It's a very sort of deeply engaging method of analysis where you're not just, finding a way to connect with the data on a semantic level, but in terms of latently what are some of the contexts and what are some of the cues and the what's and the hows, those kinds of questions that come up and start appending themselves to whatever phenomena you're trying to explore. And so there were 4 themes that I will briefly kind of go over. Starting with the first one, which I identified as names, stories, and victim visibility. And essentially, these were Instagram posts as part of the Lockdown the Lockup campaign created by Sneha. And they featured the names of 9 victims and survivors of domestic violence. Of course, their names were changed to ensure privacy and anonymity, as the campaign disclosure had made clear, and as it should be done in a case like this. But their stories of violence were all very true events. They were recalled and retold, of course, on this platform via this campaign. And in many cases, there were common patterns or cycles of violence, but they were also very unique in their context, in their condition, even in their forms. And so I came across graphic illustrations, visually charted incidents, social filters that were used by people who kind of piggybacked on this particular campaign in their images, in the way of campaign-specific color schemes, preset filters and frames that users could post to using their own selfies and also nominate others. There were campaign hashtags, powerful poems and prose that were starkly presented to shine light on the stories of violence that many women were encountering, or rather barely living through, being trapped in sort of that domestic space with their abuser during the lockdown. One thing in particular, and I would like to read that out for all of you because I know it's not very clear here. It was a poem that was part of an official campaign graphic that, Lockdown May Lockup circulated. And of course, it was accompanied by a very real story of one of the 9 victim survivors and clients of Sneha. But what's interesting is not only does the accompanying visual with that, where you see this tunnel with a little bit of a semblance of light at the end of it, frame this poem, but it also kind of speaks to symbolically the no exit, very difficult situation a lot of the women found themselves. So, excuse me, while I take my glasses off and read. Hope is a fault. It is a chink in the armor of your instincts that helps you survive. It is that devil which whispers in your ear that things will be better that things can be better. It masquerades like little joys that well-wishers and magazine covers ask you to believe in. They say, do it for the dawn sun. And again, as I said, there's no direct, intimation or allusion to the fact that this is connected to women stuck in violent situations. But to use a cliche, if you do read between the lines, or if you connect it at least to the visual power of the imagery behind it, a lot of what these women were going through is kind of made clear. And so in the same token, in particular, what struck out was how these 9 names and stories, curated as a digital moment within Instagram, functioned both as a microcosm of the multiple types of abuse that hundreds and thousands of Indian women regularly face at home. And also these stories speak to the range, which is unthinkable sometimes, of the violence that women endure. And one story, for example, speaks of a woman who, and to quote from the LGMLU post from a campaign, was, to quote, brutally abused and forced into having sex with relatives and strangers by her husband for money, close quote. To another case where a woman, to quote from another campaign image, within quotes, was rescued from her captivity by her brothers. She had gone 6 days without food or water, and this was in her marital home. So this pattern, and there were so many stories like this, some of those stories probably did not even make it to the campaign, also and they were also presented as digitally, as digital illustrations, accompanying single quotes, likely from abusers during the incident or violence, and later recalled by victims who may have reported it to the nonprofit. And to quote from, again, the campaign visuals, Neha shared some of these reported reasons for DV infliction, such as the complaint that she overslept or that she dared to wear lipstick. Yeah, these were reasons used for physical, verbal, sexual, and other mental and emotional forms of harm, bruises, battery that were inflicted on her. With every case or story that was shared, the campaign also added public awareness of the urgency of that critical pandemic moment. Their message was clear, and at the end of most campaign visuals, they had that message. And to quote them, it doesn't take much for a woman to get beaten up. And they also have their solution in there, at least the short term one, that the process of getting her the help she needs doesn't take much either. It begins with a donation, however small it may be, to kickstart the process of rescue, therapy, and rehabilitation. Now, the next theme, that I call violence visuals, this related more to the hashtag itself, lockdown the lockup, more than the campaign as well. And it applied to domestic violence symbolizing imagery that was shared on Instagram. And I went ahead and categorized that either as having organic value or earned value. And I'll explain why. The organic violence visuals were images and selfies of celebrity Indian Instagrammers, like Bollywood actors like Diya Mirza, Kalki Koshlan, Radhika Apte. Some of you may be familiar with these names, some of you may not. But they have a lot of social currency in the Indian celebrity scene. And there were many, many others who voluntarily advocated for this campaign, for the hashtivism. They made it viral even after being nominated by invested others. And they did the same by nominating at least 3 other people in their digital networks. Now, the earned Instagram visuals included many dramatically positioned, photographic, animated, and custom pop-art that was meant to inform digital publics about the types of violence that were being perpetrated on women, and also the varied tools or weapons that were being used by abusers to inflict physical and mental harm. And some of these were black and white images, as you can see up here, of a cigarette butt on the ashtray, of these bunch of hangers hanging on this makeshift kind of clothesline. And what's interesting is these are everyday objects, right? They just lie around our house. For a purpose which is very different than what they were used for, as the campaign says. And I think what's more powerful is the fact that it just says out there, this is not a cigarette butt, or this is not a hanger, that it can be used in the same way to inflict harm on a vulnerable population. And so, some other images, they provided numbers. They shared statistical frequency of domestic violence during India's lockdown, timely information about COVID-related, resources, immobility and at-risk factors, so on and so forth. And perhaps some of the images that stood out the most were the ones that weren't officially created by the campaign, but that were still kind of created by invested others and still used that same hashtag and also tagged Sneha's official Instagram page. And some of that, as you can see here, are, again, very dramatic visual compositions. Many of them actually have women using cosmetic art or makeup to create post-violence, facial visuals and expressions and emotions. Many of them were in sepia tones. They were deeply contrasting colors that were also used, so on and so forth. And as disturbing and stark as many of these visuals were, they collectively explain, to quote Bucco, that this anti-domestic violence campaign's intended tendency to transform civic awareness into a performative act which gains value through its visibility on social media. I'm going to very briefly go over the next two themes because I would like to keep a couple of minutes at the end for questions. Probably the most direct form of celebrity-led selfie resistance in the case of the campaign was, as I mentioned some time back, was the soft power of Bollywood that pushed it forward, right? And again, as I said, Bollywood is the Indian and Hindi film industry primarily out of Mumbai. And it's interesting because for a large percentage of the Indian population, Bollywood holds as much social currency and affinity and opinion leadership as other forms of institutional loyalty that people have, whether it's family or religion or traditions, community, etc. And most of these famous Indian influencers, from Bollywood or not, already have a substantial presence and following on social media. In fact, social media has, to a great extent, helped to make their day-to-day lives much more real and much more authentic, accessible, even relatable, even ordinary, I would say. Even objectionable if they, want to just directly call them out, and critical, for the Indian public. And in many ways, it's almost like breaking the fourth wall and leveling the distance between celebrities and their fans. And this is what happened to a large extent and helped to kind of push the campaign sort of forward, connected with this idea of producing and maintaining sociability, which is very fundamental to celebrity culture, and it worked in the favor of Lockdown and Lockup, coupled with Instagram, using this platform's sort of algorithmic potential to support this performed connectivity, this performed authenticity and intimacy that was happening. And finally, the last theme that kind of that I quoted many of the images into had what I call focused or co-opted versions of visual hashtivism. For example, talking of some of the focused visuals, there were many dramatically composed black and white photographs that juxtaposed powerful images of female actors performing domestic violence victims and survivors' experiences, and also interventionists within the same frame. Some of them were in facial poses symbolizing emotional desperation or sadness or pain or numbness, help-seeking, maybe in the former case. In the latter case, that is in the case of the interventionists or the advocates, there were expressions of empathic listening or help delivering nonverbals. And it's interesting here because it is curious and yet understandable that in most such images, the faces of the actor per se or the authentic victim survivors are not made visible from the front. They are not shown fully, as you can see here with one of those images on the top right there. But as over-the-shoulder profiles with hands maybe covering the face or resting in the face as if in tears, in deep thought or despair. And this kind of made me go back and think about Sanaz Raji's work, where she says that embodied resistance using corporeal visuals, bodily visuals, and meaningful selfies is not always about the face or the body, but rather about the message that one is sort of attempting to convey. And this is, I think, by far, some of the major sort of patterns of visual connectivity, leading to some form of short-term collectivism that came out of this. And so looking back, it was evident that this particular campaign, Lockdown May Lock Up, and its possibilities for selfie resistance, or at least the moment of selfie resistance and visual activism came out of an absolute need to do something urgent, to do something palpable, to help a very resource-limited, at-risk group of women at a time when their mental, their emotional, their physical, their sexual health, and their situation overall was even more threatened by the forced immobilities created because of the quarantine. And the short-term success of the digital campaign, as I mentioned a little bit of that before, it was there. They raised all the funds that they needed, and they created a second sort of sub-campaign to raise even more. They surpassed their initial goal of their fundraising. There was a high level of social engagement, with almost 2,000 posts circulated and created within 5 days of its launch, which for a particular campaign like this is a big thing. So the visual movement in this sense, became a significant container and even a media platform for activism in what I believe has been a space of liminal and locally situated activism. That is, yes, it raised the funds for interventions. It raised and it came up with some safety measures for abused women during one of the most critical and immobile periods our recent history and the pandemic. However, if we talk about long-term impact, that still remains to be seen. Because I think a big part of that is contingent on how much of that deeper structural issues that perpetuate a lot of these gender inequities that lead up to violence against women, or create more situations for it, in India in this case, are addressed, and when will they be addressed, if at all? And yes, of course, I'm not disputing that there's an entire body of knowledge and research on online feminist activism that exposes and critiques the challenges that women and other at-risk publics face within digital platforms as well, from maybe digital misogynists or trolls, who take on the same social platforms to undermine feminist agency, or to create new cycles of violence, or maybe push similar victim-blaming narratives in online discursive spaces. And yes, it is also really important that research should also kind of keep sort of engaging with and exploring how some of these forms of digitized violence and their connection to things like toxic patriarchy and repressed sexuality is crucial to understanding and challenging this kind of online vitriol. But that said, what I am more invested in, and whatever epistemological disagreements that folks might have, there is also decade-long research on this form of activism, visual selfie activism, digital movements, that basically tells us that people sharing and the people seeing these visuals through such visual signifiers get a chance to engage in meaningful resistance at specific moments, whether it's digitally or on the ground. And this is what led me to where I was really interested. This idea of the to-be-looked-atness quality of visual signifiers like selfies and other powerful graphics that have the capability, again, to kind of quote Deborah Faraday, to be moving in that they literally move, circulating virally in a culture that produces victim survivor experiences as both unspeakable and spoken for. And this also creates research opportunities like this one, that where I got to study intersections of digital visuals, selfies, graphic artifacts, advocacy hashtags, mobilizations, alternate feminist media and mediations, all of which suggested interventions for social ills like domestic violence, which was essentially embodied in this particular digital activism, this particular case study. And on that note, and sort of as a next step, because of course there are limitations to this research study as any other research study would have, I would like to continue my engagement and sort of chart the next steps. And as a part of that, in fact, I am I have teamed up with 2 critical cultural media studies scholars, my colleagues, to explore some of the what next questions. So for example, some of the questions we are exploring is what happens to such activisms after the cause ends? In other words, the pandemic, we may be at the tail end of it. lockdown is done, does that mean that domestic violence ceases to exist? No, it doesn't. It's still there. Maybe in different forms, maybe in evolved forms, maybe there is something else waiting to happen in terms of another crisis, which kind of brings this to the surface. So rather, currently, also, turning to one of the other questions we have, where lies the responsibility of folks like feminist scholars, advocates, alternative media, stakeholders, bystanders, survivors also themselves in India and in the global south to keep up with such critical issues and injustices brought to the fore by campaigns like LDNLU and alternative feminist media. So I think with that, I'd sort of like to wrap up today's presentation. Thank you to all of you for being here today. I'm really, really grateful that you let me talk about my research, engaged with it. Everyone here in person, everyone on Zoom, thanks again. I really appreciate it. And thank you once again to WLRC for giving me this incredible space, this really, really valued opportunity to do that. So if any of you have any questions, we have a couple of minutes left. I'm happy to address. So thanks again.
So I know I'm sitting in the back of the room, which is kind of awkward, but it's because I'm also controlling the Zoom here. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides on our Zoom. And if folks have any questions here in the room, I'll also read a comment out from the chat. But I see a couple of hands here in the room. If you are on Zoom and you have a question, you can either put it in the chat. You can put it as a direct message to me, Ramona. That's the person that's speaking that you can't see. Maybe I should turn my video on so you can see me. Hello, everybody. So you can either send a chat message directly to me, or you can just make it open to everybody, and I'm happy to share it out for you. You can also use the raise hand feature on Zoom, and we'll call on you, and you can ask your question out loud. But we'll start with the two folks in the room who've already raised their hands. Whoever would like to go, please.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just one question as it relates to ethical considerations when taking or curating information from a platform like Instagram. So the actual campaign, which was put out by the organization, I'm okay with that, but persons responded as well. Persons may have used images and so on, and that was also considered once it had the hashtag as well. So what were the considerations when curating that sort of content as well, other than removing the name, the identifiers, which you had said?
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. And yes, that's a very important question. So again, I think when I sort of clarified my criteria for my selection criteria, I only basically used the graphics that were officially a part of the campaign, and some of them that were curated or rather used by other Instagrammers, either sharing what the original campaign graphics was, so reposting it, and some of them also created their own images, as I said, but they were all publicly available. So none of this none of the data that I used was private in any way, or I actually did not take anything from the comments specifically, because I understand that that is definitely a consideration for which I would have to have more kind of ethical sort of variables in place to consider when doing that. So the names as such were already anonymized by the campaign. And other than whatever was there in the visuals in my paper and in my analysis as well, I did not go back and look for to any of those names. I did not disclose any names associated with even those who posted the non-campaign or the non-official, rather I should say non-Sneha images. But it was essentially just about the particular graphic, and that was already public. It was on the public platform. It was meant to be circulated by others. So I don't know if that helps sort of answer your question a little bit, but I totally understand where you're coming from, because in the past, when I've done research work, particularly looking at domestic violence sort of testimonies given by some identified individuals on blog platforms, I had to kind of not only have my own Google, but also do certain other kinds of look out for certain other markers and have that in mind when addressing it. So I hope that addresses.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for like researching on such important topic.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, when I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking like there might be like beyond this campaign, there might be maybe other people who couldn't have like reach to this campaign and express what they are going through. So that was kind of like horrific situation I was thinking about when listening to your presentation. I have a like since I was a bit late and I missed the like sampling part. So if I may ask you, like did you only focus on the images or like images also text like because you read out a poem? So have you considered both of them?
Right. And so when I say visuals for a lot of the visuals contained text within it as well, and captions as well. So I think when, I've also explained it in my paper when I talk about these visuals and graphics as sort of artifacts on the whole, because even when there are captions associated with it or there's in text. So for example, the poem there, it was a part of that text. It was supposed to be as much a part of that visual as the image at the back. Which, again, coupled with maybe the way it was framed, or it's almost like the sepia tones used, so the black and white, or the kind of shadows and things, that also had an impact on the way the image was presented and symbolized whatever situation was being talked about. However, the text was, I think, difficult to divorce from that entire sort of experience. So I think that kind of answers your question, and I totally appreciate you mentioning that. There was a time where, even though my interest in my research has been to essentially look at the first few steps that add to that moment of advocacy and create potential for that moment to become a movement, and essentially that is where I got interested in this campaign, because that's what it did. It tried to reach out to those people who did have access, so that they could then spread and make the message viral, so that those who did not always have access and whose stories did not ultimately make it here also at least have the more practical resources, the more sort of on-the-ground resources that we begin to. So this campaign also had a very on-the-ground component to it, in terms of the funds that were raised, or the more people power that were sort of added to creating institutions.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Again, thank you for the presentation. It was really fascinating. I have, forgive me, 2 questions. The first one was what you said the campaign enjoyed some short-term success, and going along with that, you stated that they fundraised and then succeeded at that and fundraised again, and they had a lot of engagement online. They raised funds for intervention. I was just curious about if there was any figures about the funds that were raised for intervention and the resources that were distributed, if that was made public by the organization themselves. I'm not asking if you have it on hand, or I'm just curious if the information exists.
That is a very good question, and I actually don't have that information on hand, because as I'm speaking to you, I've already reached out to the organization for the possibility, both the organizations Sneha as well as Siriti, to ask them if they are at liberty to share some of that information. So far, I don't have that information, but especially for the next couple of steps, I wanted to have that information so that we can use it sort of as a jumping off point.
Excellent.
But that is definitely something where, talking of some of the limitations which any campaign would have, any kind of advocacy initiative would have, I think that there was a little bit of lack of transparency there towards the end. But I also wonder, and I feel, and with my colleagues and I have also had a conversation about this, is whether it had something to do with the fact that because this campaign ended almost very sort of neatly, so to speak, by the time the lockdown was officially ended, whether that had something to do with them sort of losing momentum for some amount of time, and then not sharing this beyond maybe just certain bodies who they had to share that information with. And it's a little challenging in certain contexts, particularly in the global south, to get a lot of transparency around a lot of these issues. So I'm working on it. We'll see if we get more information.
Well, yeah, no, certainly. I'm not trying to ask you directly. I was more asking about the nature of the organization themselves and how they carried it out. So that makes sense to me. And it segues directly into my second question, which was the limitations of online advocacy and Instagram as a platform. You alluded to that. And I was just curious if maybe you could expand on that a little bit. And specifically, I was curious if you had some sort of opinion on, how other actors in online activism in various sectors have experienced what's known as shadow banning. And that's more or less overt censorship by Instagram that we don't have much transparency into. But I was curious if you've heard of that and if you think that there's any, I don't know, just your thoughts on the limitations of Instagram as a platform for activism, just what I'm asking.
Again, thank you for that question. And yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think when we talk about whether the algorithmic affordances or just the architecture of particular platforms that lend themselves to certain things, one of the reasons I started looking at Instagram for this is actually the campaign that led me to the platform. And also because, Instagram, like, some other platforms are known for their visual currency, which, as I mentioned during the presentation, lend self-worth. But that is not to say that, there aren't limitations, because at the end of the day, it is also a media that can be used for capitalistic purposes, for consumerism, for those kinds of things. So there is always a risk. And also kind of to come back to, which is one of the reasons why I was tempted, but tried to keep myself away from looking at a lot of the comments, because I knew that there would be probably more disappointment than, sort of even sort of reinforcement of some of this kind of advocacy happening there. Although I was pleasantly surprised to see that there was a lot of support as well. But oftentimes there is, which is, we have these polarizations happening. But I think even in terms of, research in this area, particularly looking at Instagram as a platform for visual resistance or, selfie activism or whatever. It's also been talked about how within creating avenues for visibility, it's also negotiating invisibility politics to a certain extent, right? It does that. I mean, for example, the same person's work who I've used quite a bit here, Sanaz Raji, she at one point, sort of as an extension of her work, asks us to consider some of the deeper questions regarding, who has access to this form of visual digital activism or these digital spaces, whether it is enough to represent marginalized groups and their intersectional issues. Well, of course it is. I mean, I think you all know. But again, going back to the fact that, my intention with this as a pilot study was to start on that sort of understanding and point to see to what extent is mobilization happening. Is it happening? Or is it mobilization, or is it more of a moment of inactivism and advocacy at a certain point in time? And also there has been, a common consensus, maybe a little bit going back to what you were saying, among critics, among some of the scholars, of even things like using visuals and selfies, particularly in platforms like Instagram and some of the other ones, or rather selfie-led self-presentations, that such communication can be inauthentic. That it could be narcissistic, that it would be sort of a shallow representation of a person's maybe identity or on-stage performance, or some form of clickbait, maybe some sort of a armchair activism. So while there is a little bit of truth to all of this, and we have seen, yes, it can be narcissistic, yes, it can be inauthentic in certain areas, but there is no reason why, and I think there's a lot of research in the context of every communication tool that has been used historically, that the same tools can be used. They can be weaponized, but they can also be used as advocacy mechanisms and channels. And I think that is where to have that balance in mind probably helped me to think sort of through this dynamic. So I hope that answers the question. or attempts to. Thank you.
I know that we're at time, but we do have a question from one of our Zoom participants, who is my colleague, Dr. Kelly Maganat. Kelly would like to ask a quick question and also just share information about our campus advocacy network here in the Women's Leadership and Resource Center and at UIC. So Kelly, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This is a really wonderful presentation. I really learned a lot. So I'm Kelly. I'm our primary advocate. Our services are free and confidential to all UIC students, faculty, and staff. So if you're looking for an advocate, I know the information is in the chat. You can also just directly reach out to me. Our flyers are there in the center, and you can also call me, email me, or look at our website, and there's an Ask an Advocate form that you can use as well. We're available for in-person and Zoom appointments, and for processing, safety planning, accompaniment through reporting, accessing resources. So one of the questions that came up for me, and you've already touched on it a little bit, and I know that you were directly not looking at comments, but I wonder if you have a sense of how survivors responded to the movement, if they saw their stories being told, or if they resonated with the stories that were being told, even anecdotally, if that came out at all in your research.
Thank you so much, for your question. And I'm going to sort of go back to, how when I started, talking about this, I think one thing that I needed to stay clear of, and this is why I selected sort of to go look at this from a visual framework or a visual advocacy route, is I wanted to look at the perspectives of those doing the advocating and those sort of, creating those mechanisms. Because again, in a lot of the case, in a large way, because this subject, this phenomena is so highly silenced, censored, so taboo, made so taboo, particularly in that cultural, social context, that even though it is a very public aberration, it is a human rights aberration, not just women's rights aberration, and needs that kind of, it needs that space, it needs that voice beyond, just private spaces or being depoliticized. It was really hard to find or identify reactions or comments from people who may have self-identified as being, a survivor or victim. And I wouldn't be very sure that that is something that a lot of people would do, especially if they felt that they were a part of that dynamic somehow or involved in that. But I did notice, to your point, I did notice a couple of comments from people who mentioned, and again, there was no way for me to know if they were, specifically in India at that point of time. But there were people who identified as being of South Asian origin and mentioned that, they had at one point or the other faced domestic violence, in some context or the other. And that, steps like this was really important, particularly most of them talked about how visibility for something like this, particularly in crisis moments, is what always kind of gets swept under the rugs, and how that needs to be made a priority. So a lot of people kind of felt assured when they saw images and visuals sharing information, or like helplines, or even things like these particular police stations in your locality have women police officers or female police officers, or these particular community-based organizations have female advocates, or if language is a problem, there are these translation services, right? And then some of them were not just visuals, but even when I was looking at some of the metatext, some of this was shared by people, not just in Mumbai, but there were people in probably other states and cities who were kind of putting that information out there. So there was a little bit of a kind of alternate community of information sharing and collectivism sort of being formed there as well. So I think, but beyond that, I didn't really find, and neither did I really spend that much of time, in all sort of honesty, to look at some of the impressions of people who may have been associated directly or indirectly with that particular campaign or that time. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for your question.
All right. I think with that, since we are over time, that we're going to go ahead and wrap up. So please join me again in thanking Dr. Mukherjee for this.
Will come back and continue to share your research and your work with us.
I would
It's
love
so
to.
important.
You have me, I would want to.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks again, guys. Thanks.